I'm going to read 3 columns by Spengler concerning j.r.r. Tolkien, Richard Wagner, and Christian and pre-Christian societies. David Paul Goldman, born in 1951, is known for his series of online essays in the Asia Times under the pseudonym Spengler. This material is okay to be listened to by children. The Ring and the Remnants of the West, from the Asia Times, January 11, 2003. The most important cultural event of the past decade is the ongoing release of the film version of j.r.r. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. No better guide exists to the mood and morals of the United States. The rapturous response among popular audiences to the first 2 installments of the trilogy should alert us that something important is at work. Richard Wagner's 19th century tetralogy of music dramas, The Ring of the Nibelungs, gave resonance to National Socialism during the interwar years of the last century. Tolkien does the same for Anglo-Saxon democracy. Tolkien well may have written his epic as an anti-ring to repair the damage that Wagner had inflicted upon Western culture. Consciously or not, the Oxford philologist who invented hobbits has ruined Wagner before the popular audience. It recalls the terrible moment in Thomas Mann's great novel Dr. Faustus, when the composer Adrian Lipperkun, finishing his Faust cantata in the throes of syphilitic dementia, announces, "I want to take it back." His amanuensis asks, "What do you want to take back?" "Beethoven's Ninth Symphony," cries Leverkun. Leverkun, on the strength of a bargain with the devil, has written a work whose objective is to ruin the ability of musical audiences to hear Beethoven. Tolkien has taken back Wagner's Ring. That may be his greatest accomplishment, and a literary accomplishment without clear precedent. To be sure, The Lord of the Rings is not a great work of literature to be compared to Cervantes or Dostoevsky, but it is a great landmark of culture nonetheless. Its revival in a reasonably faithful cinematic version has far-reaching effects on the popular mind. Wagner had done as much to Beethoven. "People don't like music, they just like the way it sounds," quipped the English conductor Sir Thomas Beecham. Beethoven's musical devices are stations along a journey which has a goal. Wagner turned these musical devices into the haunted caves and dells of a world in which the listener wanders capriciously, abandoning all sense of time and direction. Audiences never liked Wagner's music, they loved the way it sounds. Musical effects, in Beethoven, however eccentric, are subordinate to the long-range musical goal. In Wagner, musical effects are capricious events. That well suits the introduction of Wagner's Übermensch, the hero Siegfried, for reasons I will make clear in a moment. It is hard for us today to imagine what a cult raised itself around Wagner after the 1876 premiere of his Ring cycle. Compared to it, the combined fervor for Elvis, the Beatles, Madonna, and Michael Jackson seems like a band concert in the park. Perfectly sensible people attended a Wagner opera and declared that their lives had changed. Bavaria's eccentric King Ludwig II literally fell in love with the composer and built him the Bayreuth Festival, to which the elite of Europe repaired in homage. It was something like the mood that swept the youth of the West in the late 1960s, but an order of magnitude more powerful. In 1848, Wagner was a disgruntled emulator of French grand opera, who stockpiled hand grenades for revolutionaries, a fugitive from justice after that year's uprising. A quarter century later, he stood at the pinnacle of European culture. What precisely did he do? Wagner announced the death of the old order of aristocracy and church, of order and rules. Not only was the old order dying, but also it deserved to die, the victim of its inherent flaws. As the old order died, a new man would replace the servile creatures of the old laws, and a new art would become the new man's religion. The new man would be fearless, sensual, unconstrained, and could make the world according to his will. Wagner's dictum that the sources of Western civilization had failed was not only entirely correct, but also numbingly obvious to anyone who lived through the upheavals of 1848. But how should one respond to this? Wagner had a seductive answer: become your own god. Using elements of Old Norse sagas and medieval epic, Wagner cobbled together a new myth. The Norse god Wotan personifies the old order. He rules by the laws engraved on his spear, by which he himself is bound. To build his fortress, Valhalla, he requires the labor of the giants, and to pay the giants, he steals the treasure of the Nibelung dwarf Alberich. Alberich won the treasure with a magic ring he fashioned from the stolen gold of the Rhine River. Wotan covets this ring, which gives its bearer world mastery, but is compelled to give it to the giants. Wagner's audience had no trouble recognizing in Wotan and the other immortal gods the ancient aristocracy of empire and church, who made a fatal compromise with capital, the ring of world domination, and thus sealed their own doom. Siegfried, Wotan's grandson, takes the ring back from the giant Fafnir, and then shatters the god's spear and wins as his bride the immortal Valkyrie Brunhilde. Through the rest of a silly plot full of love potions and magic disguises, Siegfried is betrayed and stabbed in the back. Brunhilde immolates herself on Siegfried's funeral pyre, and the flames burn down Valhalla as well, gods and all. A new world order emerges on the basis of heroic will. It is not hard to see how appetizing this stew was for Hitler. Tolkien himself despised Wagner, whom he knew thoroughly, and rejected comparisons between his ring and Wagner's cycle. Both rings are round, is the extent of his published comment. But the parallels between the two works are so extensive as to raise the question as to Tolkien's intent. The Ring of Power itself is Wagner's invention. Also to be found in both works are an immortal woman who renounces immortality for the love of a human, a broken sword reforged, a life and death game of riddles, and other elements which one doesn't encounter every day. Here is a compilation derived from sundry websites, along with a few of my own observations. For those who don't know the details of the Tolkien ring, well, you will before long, because it is a story that everyone will learn. This is a 2-column chart with the ring on the left side and Tolkien on the right. Alberich forms a ring of power, and Sauron forges a ring of power. Wotan needs the giants to build Valhalla. The elves need Sauron to forge their rings of power. The ring gives the bearer world domination, and the ring gives the bearer world domination. Wotan uses the ring to pay the giants, and Sauron betrays the elves. The ring is cursed and betrays its bearer, and the ring is evil and betrays its bearer. Fafnir kills brother Fasolt to get the ring. Smeagol kills friend Diagol for the ring. Fafnir hides in a cave for centuries. Smeagol Gollum hides in a cave for centuries. Siegfried inherits the shards of his father's sword, and Aragorn inherits the shards of his father's sword. Brunhilde gives up immortality for Siegfried, and Arwen gives up immortality for Aragorn. Wotan plays riddles for the life of Mime, and Gollum plays riddles for the life of Bilbo. A dragon guards the Nibelung's hoard, and a dragon guards the dwarves' hoard. The gods renounce the world and await the end. and the elves renounce the world and prepare to depart. The ring is returned to its origin, the river Rhine, and the ring is returned to its origin, Mount Doom. Hagen falls into the river, and Gollum falls into the volcano. The immortals burn in Valhalla, and the immortals leave Middle-earth. In both, a new era emerges in the world, and men are left to their own devices. The details are far less important than the common starting point, the crisis of the immortals. Wagner's immortal gods must fall as a result of the corrupt bargain they have made with the giants who built Valhalla. Tolkien's immortal elves must leave Middle-earth because of the fatal assistance they took from Sauron. The elves' power to create a paradise on Middle-earth depends upon the power of the 3 elven rings, which they forged with Sauron's help. Thus the virtue of the elven rings is inseparably bound up with the one ring of Sauron. When it is destroyed, the power of the elves must fade. More than anything else, The Lord of the Rings is the tragedy of the elves and the story of their renunciation. What Tolkien has in mind is nothing more than the familiar observation that the high culture of the West arose and fell with the aristocracy, which had the time and inclination to cultivate it. With the high culture came the abuse of power associated with the aristocracy. When this disappears, the great beauties of Western civilization and much of its best thought disappear with it. That is far too simple and in some ways misleading, but it makes a grand premise for a roman à clef about Western civilization. Tolkien enthusiasts emphasize his differences with Wagner as if to ward off the disparagement that The Lord of the Rings is a derivative work. As Bradley Berzer, David Harvey, and other commentators observe, Tolkien detested Wagner's neo-paganism. He was a devout Roman Catholic and explicitly philo-Semitic, where Wagner was anti-Semitic. But this defense of Tolkien obscures a great accomplishment. He did not emulate Wagner's ring, but he recast the materials into an entirely new form. Recast is an appropriate expression. A memorable scene in Wagner shows Siegfried filing the shards of his father's sword into dust and casting a new sword out of the filings. That, more or less, is what Tolkien accomplished with the elements of Wagner's story. Wagner will still haunt the stages of opera houses, but audiences will see him through Tolkien's eyes. What does one do when the immortals depart? One acts with simple English decency and tenacity, says Tolkien, and accepts one's fate. The Lord of the Rings is an anti-epic, as Norman Cantor put it, whose protagonist is a weak, vulnerable, and reluctant hobbit, as opposed to the strong, wound-proof, and fearless Siegfried. The hobbit Frodo Baggins does his duty because he must. "I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had happened," he exclaims to the wizard Gandalf, who replies, "So do all who come to see such times. But it is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us." No utopian Gandalf. What one must do is muddle through. "I will remain Galadriel, and I will diminish," decides the elf queen of Lothlorien, rejecting the chance to take possession of the One Ring and preserve her powers. The elves choose between vanishing and accepting a taint of evil, and choose the former. Modesty, forbearance, and renunciation are the virtues that Tolkien sets against Wagner's existential act of despair. The high culture of the West is gone. The world that remains after the elves board their gray ships and sail into the West is devoid of beauty and wonder. The kingdom of men that emerges from the Lord of the Rings is a humdrum affair, in which the best men can do is to get on with their lives. Even the anti-heroes of this anti-epic, the hobbits who bear the evil ring to its ultimate destruction, cannot remain in Middle-earth. They sail off along with the elves. Those who hold America in contempt for its lack of refinement, this writer always has held the term American culture to be an oxymoron, should think carefully about this conclusion. From their founding on Christmas Day, 800 AD, when Charlemagne accepted the crown of the revived Roman Empire, institutions of the West have been formed in response to external threat. The Holy Roman Empire of the High Middle Ages, Tolkien's conscious model for the Kingdom of Gondor, arose in response to the incursions of Arabs in the south, Vikings in the north, and Magyars in the west. Boorish and gruff as the new American empire might seem, it is an anti-empire populated by reluctant heroes who want nothing more than to till their fields and mind their homes, much like Tolkien's hobbits. Under pressure, though, it will respond with a fierceness and cohesion that will surprise its adversaries. Orcs of the world, take note and beware. Tolkien's Ring, When Immortality is Not Enough, from the Asia Times, January 5, 2004. Alone among 20th century novelists, j.r.r. Tolkien concerned himself with the mortality not of individuals but of peoples. The young soldier-scholar of World War I viewed the uncertain fate of European nations through the mirror of the Dark Ages, when the life of small peoples hung by a thread. In the midst of today's great extinction of cultures, and at the onset of civilizational war, Tolkien evokes an uncanny resonance among today's readers. He did not write a fantasy, but rather a roman à clef. I spoke too soon when I wrote a year ago that a reasonably faithful cinematic version of Tolkien's trilogy, The Lord of the Rings, was the cultural event of the decade. With the third installment in cinemas, it appears that director Peter Jackson has buried Tolkien's mythic tragedy under an avalanche of tricks. One wants to hiss along with Gollum, "Stupid hobbit, it ruins it." We are left with a crackling good adventure, but we have lost something precious. Despite his huge readership, Tolkien, during his lifetime, never published the Silmarillion, the tragedy of immortals that underlies The Lord of the Rings. Instead, he hit upon the genial device of leading the reader to the elements of his story through the eyes of the little people who are entangled in it. It is as if Shakespeare had published something like Tom Stoppard's Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, rather than Hamlet. Tolkien took by the horns the great ideological beast of his time. After the Great War, the newly hatched existentialist philosophers were shocked to discover that human beings fear for their mortality. In fact, it is quite a commonplace thing to die for one's country, provided that one believes that one's country will still be there. The pull of cultural identity is so strong that men will fling themselves into the jaws of death if they believe that such actions will preserve their culture. But what if culture itself, the individual's connection to past as well as future, is in danger? Now that is really being alone in the universe. Death to preserve one's people is quite a tolerable proposition. The prospective death of the entire people along with its culture is what creates a particularly nasty type of existential angst, the sort that produces a Hitler or an Osama bin Laden. The small peoples of the Dark Ages, such as Beowulf's Geats, had to think about such things because extinction was the normal outcome. As it turned out, Tolkien's early medieval sources, he had translated Beowulf, mirrored the existentially challenged world after the Great War, precisely because the subject of a national extinction had forced its way back to the surface. The theme of national extinction permeates the entire work. "It is not your own shire," the high elf Gildor reproaches Frodo at the outset of his journey in the forests of the Shire. Others dwelt here before hobbits were, and others will dwell here again when hobbits are no more. A people vanishes from the earth when its language no longer is spoken. Tolkien did not simply invent languages, but recreated the linguistic maelstrom of the early Middle Ages, when the high speech of great civilizations faded from memory, while the dialects of small peoples dissolved into larger language groups. Tolkien's great philological skills created a unique means of portraying the temporality of the nations. As a foil to human mortality, Tolkien invented a deathless and noble race. His elves suffer from satiety with immortal life. They no longer reproduce. We meet no elf younger than a millennium. Tolkien's fair folk, endowed with marvelous powers of mind and body, possessors of a radiant high culture, merely mark the time before they must leave Middle-earth. Mercifully, we are spared their private thoughts. Imagine what dinner-table dialogue would be like between Elrond and daughter Arwen, who will renounce immortality to marry the mortal Aragorn. Why do you have to date Aragorn? What happened to that nice elf boy you were going out with in Lothlorien? Daddy, I'm 3,000 years old and have dated all the elf boys. They are so boring. Minas Tirith, for that matter, houses only half the population it could comfortably hold, as its ancient race of men fails to bring children into the world. Gondor's military weakness stems from its declining population. The army Aragorn leads to the Black Gate in the last battle numbers fewer than the vanguard of the army of Gondor in its prime. Mordor encroaches because Gondor cannot man its borders. Declining population and crumbling empire is a theme as old as Rome, of course. Nor is it only Latin. In Tolkien's Anglo-Saxon sources, the extinction of the nation lurks behind every setback. The old woman's lament at Beowulf's funeral pyre, for example, foresees the destruction of his Geats after the death of its hero and protector. From the vantage point of the trenches of the Great War, though, this echo of the Dark Ages took on a new and terrible meaning. The peoples of Europe came out to fight for their predominance and nearly annihilated each other. Today's Europeans are willing themselves out of existence. The two world wars of the 20th century destroyed the national illusions of the European peoples, their pretension to strut and swagger upon the world stage. France was the first nation to misidentify its national interests with the fate of Christendom, emulated in far more horrible form first by Russia, the god-bearing nation in Dostoevsky's words, and then by Germany. Why is it that radical Islam yet may defeat the West? Migrants from North Africa and the Middle East may overwhelm the shrinking population of Western Europe, without ever assimilating into Western European culture. Collapsing birth rates in formerly Catholic strongholds, including Quebec, coincide with negligible church attendance and demoralization within the church itself. Here is a summary of the mythic tragedy behind The Lord of the Rings. Immortality was not enough for Tolkien's light elves. Lichtalben, precisely what Wagner calls his gods. Possessive love for their own works led them to tragic errors, first among which is Fëanor's ill-advised quest for his stolen jewels, the Silmarils. That motivates the elves' exile in Middle-earth. Later, the elvish smiths of Middle-earth accept the assistance of the evil Sauron in forging the 3 elven rings of air, fire, and water. In some way or other, the vague association with Sauron contaminates the 3 rings, such that when Sauron's 1 ring is destroyed, the power of the 3 rings must fade as well. That means the end of the magical wood of Lothlorien, which Galadriel has preserved in a sort of perpetual spring, and the demise of Rivendell, which Elrond maintains as the last bastion of lore and art. Presumably Gandalf, who bears the Ring of Fire, will lose some of his power as well. Sauron furthermore corrupted the Númenóreans, a noble race of men, by convincing them that they could wrest immortality from the Valar, the gods, by invading their blessed realm, Valinor. The 9 rings granted to mortal men produce a vampire-like caricature of immortality, as the bearers fade into wraiths. The 1 ring bestows a perverse sort of immortality upon its owner, whose body ceases to age while his soul decays, like Dorian Gray's portrait. It is a warped version of the elves' immortality within the mortal world of Middle-earth. Once touched, it cannot easily be relinquished. Isildur, heir of the Númenórean faithful, cannot bear to destroy it. The hobbit's great virtue is the inner strength to part with the ring. But all of the 3 hobbits who have borne it, Bilbo, Frodo, and Samwise, ultimately must abandon Middle-earth. Immortality, once tasted, poisons the joy of Middle-earth, even for hobbits. Galadriel redeems herself by renouncing her works, although in consequence she and her people must leave the mortal realm, that is, Middle-earth. She refuses the offer of the 1 ring. I will diminish and remain Galadriel. The faithful survivors of the ruin of Númenor, of whom Aragorn is the heir, accept mortality, and thus are redeemed. Tolkien clearly stated his intentions in his correspondence. Quote, "Anyway, all this stuff is mainly concerned with fall, mortality, and the machine. With fall, inevitably, and that motive occurs in several modes. With mortality, especially as it affects art and the creative, or as I should say, sub-creative desire, it has various opportunities of fall. It may become possessive, clinging to the things made as its own. The sub-creator wishes to be the lord and god of his private creation. He will rebel against the laws of the creator, especially against mortality. Both of these, alone or together, will lead to the desire for power, for making the will more quickly effective, and so to the machine, or magic." End quote. The Faustian bargain and its resort to magic were themes long celebrated in Western culture, but Tolkien added a terrible new dimension. In Middle-earth, as in Europe during the Great War, it was not the mortality of the individual, as in Goethe, but instead the mortality of nations. No serious critic will give Tolkien a place in the literary canon, because his characters generally are stick figures, speaking in stilted declamation. But that is beside the point. He has little time to waste on the petty concerns of the sort of character that populates modern fiction. His concern is the doom of peoples, or to coin a phrase, the decline of the West. Immortality was not enough for the Europeans. That is, Christianity, in the confessional and universal Christian empire in politics, offered the Europeans a form of immortality beyond the existence of the nation. Europe fell from grace when its great constituent nations decided that this sort of immortality was not enough for them, and that they should instead fight for temporal dominance upon the earth. Exhausted from their wars, the peoples of Europe sank into a torpor that is destroying them slowly but with terrible certainty. Jackson's portrayal of Denethor, the feckless steward of Gondor, doubtless reminded Americans of European defeatism with respect to Iraq and other venues in the Middle East. Out of context, the character has little motivation. Perhaps Jackson will provide the missing background of Gondor's decline in a future extended version. It is tricky, of course, to draw analogies between the pride and folly of Fëanor or the Númenóreans in Tolkien's fantasy, and the pride and folly of the European nations in World War I. But it was a commonplace observation, after 1918, that the great European tragedy began with a misguided attempt to cheat mortality through the assertion of national supremacy. One cannot make sense of Hitler's rise to power without observing that many Germans believed with all their heart that the existence of the Volk was in jeopardy. Martin Heidegger gave, and never retracted, his wholehearted support to Hitler, believing that immersion in the Volk was a legitimate answer to the existential crisis. A tragic flaw was set in Europe's foundations in the form of its Faustian bargain with paganism. Christianity offered salvation in another world. The Europeans wanted a taste of immortality in this one. By allowing the pagans to syncretically adopt their old gods into the new religion, Christianity left the Europeans forever torn between Jesus and Siegfried. Richard Wagner returned to the old pagan sources and found in them a foretaste of the nihilism that would ravage Europe during its second 30 Years' War of 1914 to 1944. Repudiating Wagner, Tolkien hoped to link an ennobling pagan past and the Christian present. In this respect he failed utterly. He is reduced to elegiac yearning for a lost agrarian past. He is a reactionary looking backward, for his vision is too clear to allow false hopes for the European future. Tolkien kept faith with the original Christian message. Man must accept not only his own mortality, but the mortality of his nation, the extinction of his culture, the silencing of his mother tongue, and look instead toward salvation beyond all mortal hope. That is what Christianity offered the pagans during the great extinction of peoples after the collapse of Rome. Frodo knows that the entire race of hobbits will become extinct. He begins his journey with Gildor's warning that one day others will dwell in the Shire when hobbits are no more. Gildor is the first among the high elves he meets as he rides toward the Havens, in the company of Elrond and Galadriel, who, along with Gandalf, finally are revealed in their true capacity as the bearers of the 3 elven rings. But the European nations threw off the bonds of universal Christian empire, and through Wagnerian nationalism sought immortality within the mortal realm, the tragic flaw of Fëanor, Galadriel, and the rebel Eldar. The great wars and the fall of Europe were the consequence. Except in the imagination, there was no going back. The sea passage to the west, in Peter Jackson's interpretation, represents death. It might just as well represent immigration to America. Unlike all other peoples, Americans need not fear the extinction of their cultural identity, because they have none to begin with. That is America's great weakness, but also its abiding strength. It is the reason that America may well endure for all time, while the Kulturnationen dissolve into the dust to the libraries. Americans bridle when told that they have no culture. But what can they name whose loss would destroy their sense of national identity? Erase the memory of Homer, and what becomes of the Greeks? Forget Herman Melville, Mark Twain, William Faulkner, and even The Simpsons, and Americans are still Americans. If German or French were no longer spoken, the concept of Germany or France would become meaningless. At the time of their revolution, Americans considered Germany as a national language. A century from now, they might adopt Spanish. America can withstand the loss of the English language itself. As long as America's political covenant remains intact, Americans can change their culture as often as convenient. America may fulfill the Christian project as an assembly of individuals called out of the nations, cut loose from their heathen heritage, an outcome Tolkien could not have imagined. Tolkien's Christianity and the Pagan Tragedy. A review of The Children of Hurin by j.r.r. Tolkien, edited by Christopher Tolkien. From the Asia Times, April 24th, 2007. J.r.r. Tolkien was the most Christian of 20th century writers. not because he produced a Christian allegory and apologetics, like his friend C.S. Lewis, but because he uniquely portrayed the tragic nature of what Christianity replaced. Thanks to the diligence of his son Christopher, who reconstructed the present volume from several manuscripts, we have before us a treasure that sheds light on the greater purpose of his The Lord of the Rings. In The Children of Hurin, a tragedy set some 6,000 years before the tales recounted in The Lord of the Rings, we see clearly why it was that Tolkien sought to give the English-speaking peoples a new pre-Christian mythology. It is a commonplace of Tolkien scholarship that the writer, the leading Anglo-Saxon scholar of his generation, sought to restore to the English their lost mythology. In this respect, the standard critical sources, for example Edmund Wainwright, mistake Tolkien's profoundly Christian motive. In place of the heroes Siegfried and Beowulf, the exemplars of German and Anglo-Saxon pagan myth, we have the accursed warrior Turin, whose pride of blood and loyalty to tribe leave him vulnerable to manipulation by the forces of evil. Tolkien's popular Ring trilogy, as I have attempted to show, sought to undermine and supplant Richard Wagner's operatic Ring cycle, which had offered so much inspiration for Nazism. With the reconstruction of the young Tolkien's prehistory of Middle-earth, we discern a far broader purpose, to recast as tragedy the heroic myths of pre-Christian peoples, in which the tragic flaw is the pagan's tribal identity. Tolkien saw his generation decimated and his circle of friends exterminated by the nationalist compulsions of World War I. He saw the cult of Siegfried replace the cult of Christ during World War II. His life's work was to attack the pagan flaw at the foundation of the West. It is too simple to consider Tolkien's protagonist Turin as a conflation of Siegfried and Beowulf, but the defining moments in Turin's bitter life refer clearly to the older myths, with a crucial difference: the same qualities that make Siegfried and Beowulf exemplars to the pagans instead make Turin a victim of dark forces and a menace to all who love him. Tolkien was the anti-Wagner, and Turin is the anti-Siegfried, the anti-Beowulf. Tolkien reconstructed a mythology for the English, not, as Wainwright and others suggest, because he thought it might make them proud of themselves, but rather because he believed that the actual pagan mythology was not good enough to be a predecessor to Christianity. Quote, alone among 20th century novelists, j.r.r. Tolkien concerned himself with the mortality not of individuals, but of peoples. The young soldier scholar of World War I viewed the uncertain fate of European nations through the mirror of the Dark Ages, when the life of small peoples hung by a thread. End quote. I wrote in an earlier essay. Christianity demands of the Gentile that he reject his sinful flesh and be reborn into Israel. Only through a new birth can the Gentile escape the death of his own body, as well as the death of his hopes and the inevitable extinction of his people. Tolkien is a writer of greater theological depth than his Oxford colleague C.S. Lewis, in my judgment. Lewis is a felicitous writer and a diligent apologist, but mere allegory along the lines of the Narnia series can do no more than restate Christian doctrine. It cannot really expand our experience of it. Tolkien takes us to the dark frontier of a world that is not yet Christian, and therefore is tragic, but has the capacity to become Christian. It is the world of the Dark Ages, in which barbarians first encounter the light. It is not fantasy, but rather a distillation of the spiritual history of the West. Whereas C.S. Lewis tries to make us comfortable in what we already believe by dressing up the story as a children's masquerade, Tolkien makes us profoundly uncomfortable. Our people, our culture, our language, our toehold upon this shifting and uncertain earth are no more secure than those of 1,000 extinct tribes of the Dark Ages, and a greater hope than that of the work of our hands and the hone of our swords must avail us. Tolkien set the children of Hurin in a doomed world menaced by a fallen angel of sorts, the Lucifer-like Morgoth. An alliance of mortal men and immortal elves attacks Morgoth's stronghold, but is crushed and dispersed. Only a few hidden elvish strongholds remain free. Hurin is the lord of a small land and a leader of the failed alliance against Morgoth. He is taken prisoner and his country overrun and occupied, his people reduced to slavery. His young son Turin escapes and is adopted by the elven king of the secret city of Gondolin. Rather than remain with the elves and await the divine intervention of elvish prophecy that ultimately will destroy Morgoth, Turin grows to impetuous manhood and sets out to seek revenge or death. Morgoth has cursed Turin's family, and the curse succeeds not by force of magic, but through Turin's own stubbornness and resentment. With the occupation of his homeland and the destruction of his clan, Turin would rather perish in a futile gesture of resistance than master his own hatred. Through his agents, Morgoth entraps Turin in a web of lies that prevent him from reuniting with his family, except under sordid circumstances. It is Turin's own flaws, not Morgoth's magic, that make him susceptible to these traps. In Tolkien's mythology, the Valar are gods of whom Morgoth was a renegade. It is through their aid that Morgoth's fortress of Thangorodrim will one day be thrown down. An elvish lord attempts to convince Turin that thoughtless pursuit of warfare will not succeed. Quote, "Petty victories will prove profitless at the last, for thus Morgoth learns where the boldest of his enemies are to be found, and gathers strength great enough to destroy them. Only in secrecy lies hope of survival, until the Valar come." End quote. To this Turin rejoins, quote, "The Valar, they have forsaken you, and they hold men in scorn. What use to look westward across the endless sea to a dying sunset in the west? There is but one Vala with whom we have to do, and that is Morgoth, and if in the end we cannot overcome him, at least we can hurt him and hinder him. Though mortal men have little life beside the span of the elves, they would rather spend it in battle than fly or submit." End quote. His lack of faith makes him desperate, and his acts of heroic desperation have terrible consequences. In The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien returned to this theme of faith in a higher power rather than in one's own force of arms. It is not the valor of the small remnant of free peoples that overcomes Sauron, Morgoth's successor, but rather the improbable mission of the Ring-Bearer that will overcome the darkness that threatens Middle-earth. After the exchange, cited above, Turin's arrogance causes the destruction of the elvish stronghold of Nargothrond by the dragon j.r.r. Once again a fugitive, Turin becomes the leader of a band of woodmen. When j.r.r. reappears to menace them, he sets out to kill the dragon and save his people, in precise emulation of Beowulf's single combat with the barrow-dwelling dragon. Like Beowulf, Turin slays the dragon, and like Siegfried, he is bathed in the dragon's blood when he stands upon the dying beast to gloat. Siegfried's bath in dragon's blood, however, makes him invulnerable to weapons, except for the one spot on his back where a treacherous spear thrust will kill him. Turin, by contrast, is immobilized by the venomous blood, long enough for a horrible event to occur. This will provoke him to kill himself with his own blade. Morgoth's vengeance is complete at the conclusion of this dark and sad tale. What made Beowulf a great man to the anonymous Saxon bard, who composed the only major Old English work of the 9th century, was his willingness to defend his people against monsters. His death in single combat with the dragon might mean the destruction of his people, as the old woman's lament at his pyre makes clear. Turin saves his little band by destroying the dragon, but only after he has allowed the dragon to destroy a great elven city. Gloating over his victim leads to his own destruction. Siegfried's fearlessness before his dragon is rewarded in the form of invincibility. Turin's fearlessness is born of despair and therefore expresses self-destructiveness. It is punished by an awful chain of events that I will leave readers of the book to discover for themselves. It is useful to contrast Tolkien's purpose to that of T.S. Eliot, too often held up as the exemplary Christian poet of the 20th century. Eliot sifted through the detritus of the pagan past in the cellars of Christianity, as he wrote in his notes to The Waste Land, 1922, quote, "To another work of anthropology I am indebted in general, one which has influenced our generation profoundly. I mean The Golden Bough," end quote, of James Frazer. Frazer attempts to show that all Christian imagery and ritual derive from pagan myth, for example, the commonplace idea of a sacrificed god. His conclusions have been rejected by later scholars, but the relevant point regarding Eliot is that he embraced the pagan antecedents of Christianity as he thought it was, even though it turned out to be something else than he thought. Tolkien knew far more about the pagan past than Eliot. As the great philologist of his time, he produced the first readable translation of Beowulf, as well as seminal editions of the most important of Anglo-Saxon classics. He loved the material more than any man living, but unlike the dilettantish Eliot, the authority Tolkien sacrificed his love for the Anglo-Saxon sources, and chose to transform the modern memory of it by creating a variant of it more congenial to Christianity. That is the miracle of the children of Hurin. Not the least of Tolkien's legacy is a son with the devotion and craft to reconstruct the projects of his father's youth. We owe Christopher Tolkien a great debt of gratitude for putting this work before us. Readers who enjoyed The Lord of the Rings as a work of fantasy, which it most surely is not, will find the present volume tough going, for it comes out of the world of Anglo-Saxon epic. As the editor reports, Tolkien originally cast it as poem in alliterative verse in the Anglo-Saxon fashion. But for readers who want to understand better what Tolkien is driving at, this work of the writer's youth will provide insight, as well as a few tranquil hours of respite from the noise and clutter of the world. This ends the reading.